Okay. Good evening, colleagues, and welcome to this special Sunday conversation series of the Guyana Business Journal. I'm Terrence Blackman, your host, associate professor and chair of the Department of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, and founder of the Guyana Business Journal. Today, in the light of the current events, the Venezuelan referendum that broadly purports to annex and incorporate into its own territory Guyana's Essequibo region and its aftermath, we continue our exploration of Guyana's emergence as a petrostate and its implications for the Guyana Essequibo Venezuela border controversy. Today's conversation will be led by Rear Admiral retired Gary Anthony Rodwell Bess. Rear Admiral Bess is a former chief of staff of the Guyana Defense Force and an attorney at law. He holds a PhD in international relations from the University of the West Indies and an MSc in global studies from the University of the West Indies and a Masters of Law from the UK. A bachelor's degree equivalent in nautical science from Brazil. Rear Admiral Best is an alumnus of the National Defense University in the USA, the Harvard Kennedy School of Government in the USA, and the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management in Germany. He has considerable experience in maritime law, strategic studies, defense, and national security. He is the former presidential advisor on the environment and the past columnist with the Guyana Chronicle on the green economy matters. Rear Admiral Bess has presented several academic papers at conferences hosted by the Institute of International Relations of the University of the West Indies and the University of Guyana. And he is a founder, I believe, of the Laird's think tank. He's a member of the Laird's think tank at the University of Havana. And has also participated at the Anton de Kom University in Suriname and the Australian National University. Rear Admiral Best is a staunch advocate of national defense, national security, and good governance, and he is a leading voice for safeguarding Guyana's patrimony in the current context of the crisis with Venezuela. Dr. Bess, welcome to the GBJ on Sunday. I trust
Thank
that
you very much. That's a long introduction, but I'm nonetheless pleased. Thank you very much.
It is a long but vital introduction. You know, I wanted to start before I got into sort of substantive matters. I was reminded today that we met many years ago. And in that conversation, I think we had dinner at some point. I was trying to recall the location of dinner. In that conversation, you know, you talked about the border controversy and its potential implications. And I don't know if it was you, but somehow I somehow have this phrase in my mind of, you know, someone saying to me at some point, if you can't defend it, you don't really own it. And I suspect that it came from this sort of conversation that we had many, many years ago in which we identified items like the border and, you know, health preparedness in terms of, you know, something like COVID, which ultimately, and then the third thing was an environmental issue, which you talked about, the seawalls and the necessary and the need for the seawalls to be maintained and be strengthened in this regard. And so I wanted to welcome you and to say to our viewers that, you know, you're someone who has not just come to this issue today, but you're someone who's been thinking about this issue in a very serious way for a very long time. As we have sort of come to the program, a couple of things have emerged, and I want you, kind of in an initial sense, to sort of respond to them. So, one, to our deep dismay, we've lost a number of members of the military who I'm sure you've served with in this plane crash, in this helicopter crash. Two, in relation to our issues as goes to the border, there is a planned meeting between President Irfan Ali and President Maduro. This has been mediated by Ralph Gonzalez in his role as the convener of CELAC. And then three, because I'm someone who's interested in cricket, we've seen the recent passing of Clyde Butts, and I wondered if, just before we went into anything serious, that you might sort of comment on those three issues.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Blackman. Yes, and they're all three serious matters, I would say. It is a tragic loss to me and to the Guyana Defense Force on the passing of, tragically, I must say, of the 5 officers and 1 other rank, whom I all knew, some more than others, some very personal. So it struck me, and I'm still recovering from it. I spoke this morning on Face the Nation, and I thought I humanized some of what those officers did. They did tremendous work in the Guyana Defense Force. I will say this: when you join the Guyana Defense Force, when one joins the Guyana Defense Force, it is a commitment to give one's life in the event it becomes necessary for the nation state. It's the highest level of service, and that's what, and theirs is the highest level of service. And those of us who would terminate our service or come bring it to an end without having to give our lives, I guess that's God's gift to us. But theirs is the highest of service. And to Clyde Butts, I knew him not as well as you did. I'm a cricket fan, and that is also tragic. There's another national icon we've lost, and I'm sure he will be well mourned and well remembered. And though I did not know him personally, I knew of him, and I know what he's done for Guyana. So in those 2 instances, yes. The most recent meeting is planned by President Ali and President Maduro. That is of serious concern to the Guyanese public, I would say that, and to myself, obviously. I start by saying that the Geneva Agreement was the post organization formula for the continued interaction between Venezuela and Guyana. Its main and single purpose was to deal with the border controversy and not the border per se. Those borders were settled in 1899. And the border controversy, though not spoken of in this particular instance, in this particular regard, let me say that the border controversy arose through a posthumous letter, a letter that's written by Mali Provost, claiming that there was collusion during the 1899 arbitral award. And because of that accusation or inference from this posthumous letter, which he did not sign, the framers of the agreement agreed that it has to be a border controversy and not a border dispute because the borders were settled. So this controversy is about this particular letter. And it became difficult continuously for Venezuela to have discussions with Guyana on the border controversy because they had no evidence to produce. Instead, Venezuela kept attempting to expand the Geneva Agreement to discuss other things, more particularly the border dispute. And Guyana continuously refused to do that. So what we find happening is, from time to time, the border controversy is being interpreted as a border dispute. It is not the border dispute, nor a border dispute. It's just a controversy that arose from the Mali Provost letter. And that is why Venezuela believes this case is weak at the ICJ, because they will have to present evidence to the ICJ to convince the ICJ that the actual award is not valid. Because the only thing before the ICJ is the validity of the award and not a border dispute or any dispute whatsoever. So I think a lot of persons are interchanging the 2 issues and not recognizing that they're separate and apart. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. So in relation to the planned meeting, and I've seen some correspondence in the public domain, if the president is not discussing anything about the border, the question that arises is what is there to discuss? Because we've gone through all discussions already, and the matter is at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. In my opinion, the fact that the matter is at the ICJ means, in my opinion, that the Geneva Agreement has expired, because it is the Geneva Agreement that led to the matter going to the ICJ via the UN Secretary General. So in my view, the Geneva Agreement has expired, and therefore one cannot return to it because the matter is at the ICJ. So the question that arises, what is there to discuss if it's not the border controversy, which President Ali said clearly is not going to be part of the discussion. So as far as I'm concerned, I believe that the only thing that can be discussed by the president at this meeting is for President Maduro to walk back on all those decisions that he's made nationally that continues to threaten Guyana. Walk back the annexation, the proposed annexation of Venezuela, and walk back the organization structure he has created in his country that continues to threaten Guyana. I believe if President Ali puts that on the table for discussion as the only an important matter to discuss, I think he'll be doing well and acquitting himself well and in accordance with what is expected by the Guyanese population. And of course, there is to be no discussion on any joint development of the Essequibo region. That is something Venezuela has put to Guyana many times, and it has always been rejected. We cannot discuss a joint development in a region when you are claiming the region, when you're, and more so now when you're threatening to annex this region. So I think the Guyanese expect that the only kind of discussion the president can have there is to really have President Maduro walk back on all those decisions that continues to threaten Guyana. And as I speak, I like to remind our listeners that Venezuela is still occupying a part of Guyana. That is the Ankoko Island. I think it's 7.5 square miles, half of which belong to Guyana. Venezuela in 1966 took over the entire island and still occupies it. So we're dealing with a big bully here, and one has to understand that in the context. So that is my response to what is happening more recently between Guyana and Venezuela, and between the fact that President Ali is going to meet President Maduro. If I were to advise President Ali from the initial step, I would say not to meet with President Maduro until he walks back all those decisions, so you meet on the same ground and he doesn't feel he's under duress in any kind of meeting. But I was not part of that advisory group. But I would say now that he has not met him as yet, that what is important is to have, for discussion, a walking back of all those decisions that continue to threaten Guyana. And may I say, Dr. Blackman, there is no evidence that Guyana can actually threaten Venezuela or threaten regional security or threaten the peace in the region. We don't have assets that can threaten this region. So the only person that is threatening the region is President Maduro. So again, if we're having discussions about threatening the region, what can Guyana be saying about that? What can Guyana walk back from threatening the region? There isn't anything. We have no history of doing it. We don't have the kind of assets to do it. So the threat to the region is President Maduro's actions. So I'm happy to see that, notwithstanding what I said, that President Lula is involved, because the extent to which he's involved, I believe some aspect of BRICS might be involved. And we go into the geopolitical realm here. Perhaps the BRICS are involved too, to some extent, some members, because South Africa is part of BRICS. And there may be other actors behind the scene who are involved in this issue. But the important thing to remember is that it's not about the border between Guyana and Venezuela. That is before the ICJ. So it can only be about President Maduro's decisions that continue to threaten Guyana.
Yeah, I was earlier rereading the Venezuela-Guyana border arbitration of 1899, an appraisal by Cedric Joseph, and it makes for really good reading. And I think it's something that should be. There are two parts to this, and it's something that should be recommended to many of us in Guyana. And what you've just described is sort of the broad context in which Venezuela raises in a letter to the Secretary General dated, I think, 18 August 1962, and I think it submits this on August 21, 1962, in which claims that she was forced to accept a treaty of arbitration whose terms were to a disadvantage, and broadly, this letter that you talked about Prevost. I mean, their case, in a sense, hinges on this Prevost letter, and it is something that I think we ought to do a better job at in terms of educating our young people about the broad sort of history of what is required in this context. I wanted just to push you just a little further. You've given us some sense of the historical overview of the Guyana Venezuela territorial controversy. You've highlighted the milestone of the Geneva agreements. What I wanted to say, so given your experience in defense and national security, what in your sense are the major geopolitical dynamics that are at play here, and how do they impact the current state of affairs? It feels like if this thing has just come completely out of the blue, and so many people, in many places that I operate, have, we have a sense of like, why now? Why is this occurring now? What's really going on here? And from your perspective as someone who's steeped in defense and national security, what's going on here from this perspective?
A good question, Terence. And there's so many different. I think there are a lot of moving parts right at the moment. Geopolitically speaking, I think one must also consider that the United States is fighting a proxy war with Russia, and the proxy for that war is Ukraine. So I think in our calculus, geopolitical calculus, we cannot subtract from our own analysis the possibility that Russia may want a proxy war with the United States, and Guyana becomes a proxy, and Venezuela becomes the hammer. So we have to assess that perhaps Russia is trying to influence itself within this sphere, using Venezuela. That should be within our calculus. We also have occurring the easing of sanctions by United States against Venezuela to allow Chevron to produce oil, and President Biden is under severe pressure to bring down inflation, to keep inflation low. So the U.S. is looking for alternative energy sources. So those sanctions were eased, not lifted, eased, in exchange for elections by President Maduro. Now, Guyana has always been the boogeyman for Venezuela when it came to elections. So something else is happening to cause President Maduro to go so far. And usually, international pressure from Guyana through its diplomacy, active defense diplomacy, always give Venezuela cause to pause. Historically, on this occasion, didn't happen. So something else is happening within that matrix. And I believe it has to do with what is happening geopolitically and also what is happening within South America. The Americans are pressing Maduro to have free and fair elections. I put it in uplifted comments in Venezuela. There's an opposition that is appearing to be more popular than President Maduro. Mind you, any opposition government in Venezuela historically conducts itself in the same manner in relation to the territory of Guyana. So this analysis has nothing to do with the opposition will be better than Maduro. But I think he's pushed the envelope that far that he himself is on a precipice. Perhaps this meeting that between President Ali and President Maduro could say to him or show to him, you're on a precipice of disaster, a precipice of trouble. And perhaps we can have a walk back from it. But coming back to the original question, what is happening geopolitically? What is my sense? I think all those things are happening at the same time. Also, I should mention that back in the 80s, we had a bipolar world. So foreign policy was developed within the bipolar context. subsequent to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain that came down, the fall of the Soviet Union, and that whole Warsaw environment, we ended up with a unipolar world led by the United States. But of recent vintage, I would say maybe the last decade or so, we have a multipolar world. So foreign policy now becomes more difficult because countries have to construct their foreign policy within a multipolar world, within a multipolar system. And I think that's a challenge for Guyana. Within this multipolar system, how are we going to really carve out our foreign policy? I know the PNC did it in the 80s. Foreign policy was based on an underlying position, skillfully articulated and skillfully managed, that non-aligned movement. And therefore, we were neither capitalist nor socialist. We were within that particular mostly social democrats. That's how we organized ourselves. Generating foreign policy now in a multipolar world is not easy and it's difficult. We have regional partners, regional powers also here. So we have the risk of escalation as you outlined before. Are we going to have an escalation? Will we have troops, external troops coming into the region? Will we have UN troops? Those are questions in the minds of a lot of Guyanese and
of many people. That's part of why. That's part of I thought, who can I talk to that can give us some cogent sense of what's happening here? I mean, it's many people are worried about the potential risk of an escalation.
Yes.
What are some of the key consequences and challenges that Guyana faces, and how do we respond to these challenges? What are the strategies that we have to think about in this context?
For Guyana itself, in terms of strategies, I argue that defense diplomacy is our first line of defense, but that is underpinned by an experienced foreign service, foreign diplomats, and special envoys moving around the globe and speaking continuously to heads of state and other international agencies, not sporadically, but continuously, because your foreign service has to be built in such a way that it's continuous and enduring. I think that's the problem. We lost that enduring nature of the foreign service, and of course we lost a lot of our foreign service technical and professional people. So that's on the downside for Guyana. But there's a clear and present risk to our land, our identity, and our resources by the actions of President Maduro. There is a real challenge in Guyana and a real concern that I have that we can end up under a settlement incursion. That is to say, too many Venezuelan migrants crossed the border into the county of Essequibo, and we ended up with a Palestine-Israeli type of arrangement where we have settlement incursion, and it's hard to undo settlements. So Guyana, as I have said and others have joined, we need to ensure that we are clear on the number of migrants that can be absorbed into our country. Unless we know that number, we're going to be clutching at straws. And out of that number, we then determine who are Venezuelan migrants of Guyanese descent, those who qualify to be refugees, and the others who fall within economic migrants. Within that number that we agree to as a nation, the country can absorb, all other persons outside of that number will have to be deported back to Venezuela. There is no sense, and there's no international law that compels Guyana to receive Venezuelan nationals beyond the capacity and capability of the country. And the only option is for them to be repatriated to the original country or to a third country. In this case, it would be either Suriname or Brazil. So that is a clear and present risk.
Yeah. Can I ask you to say a little bit more about that? Because, in preparation for this, someone wrote to me and they said, well, we shouldn't expect Venezuela to use military force to take control of the Essequibo. Instead, there is a simpler, harder to counter possibility. If Venezuela officially declares Essequibo as part of their territory, as they have done, yes, people are likely to naturally move there, considering it as local migration. In the thought of this author, two factors make this more likely. Firstly, Venezuelan migrants are already living, as you've just described, in Guyana, and have formed social networks that can help other Venezuelans move there. And secondly, it's going to be difficult for a military to take action against ordinary people who are simply choosing to move as they see it from one state to another in their own country. How are we responding proactively, looking down the road? How are we responding? I mean, you just talked about it, but I wanted, like, what kind of infrastructure do we have for addressing that kind of issue?
Well, that's a big issue because I mentioned before and I mentioned again, when you put Guyana and Venezuela together with a country with an air force versus a country without an air force, one with a navy versus one without a navy, and one with an army versus one without an army, we have a defense force. If you pit those two forces together, it is not a war between Venezuela and Guyana. It's really murder. It can be considered as murder between Venezuela and Guyana. So it comes to the point of alternative approaches that people talk about alternative approaches to the issue that we have. It's difficult to have an alternative approach when we're already at the ICJ.
Yeah.
What is the alternative approach? And I think the President Maduro has breached that line by creating his own alternative approach, which is outside of the Geneva Agreement. And we must understand the Geneva Agreement is a controlling mechanism. But in many instances, when you read the Geneva Agreement carefully, when I look at it and read it, it checkmated Venezuela. I think they realized subsequently they were checkmated. Many, maybe decades or years after, they recognized that they were checkmated by the agreement. And therefore, from that point in time, Venezuela became very agitated and always attempted to force something into the Geneva Agreement that did not exist in the first place, which is solving the border controversy solving the border dispute via discussions as opposed to solving the border controversy via discussions. And when you read the agreement carefully, it is difficult to solve even the border controversy via discussions because that matter could only go to the court. So I'm seeing Venezuela got checkmated in many instances, and that's why it's reacting the way it's reacting. But we have to remember also, regionally speaking, there are regional organizations that are there. CARICOM is a regional organization, CELAC, and the extent to which these organizations function in the context of national defense and regional defense is important. There is talk right now about a Caribbean Defense Force or a CARICOM Defense Force. There is talk about joining forces across the region because the world is changing. The world is becoming more multipolar. So there's all these new initiatives are coming up to create a more level and a more safe platform for our citizens to grow in and to become even better citizens. All that is happening at the same time. So alternative approaches, I would say at this point in time, let's remain in the ICJ. Let's continue to talk. Let's have diplomatic relations. We must go beyond the situation in Venezuela right now because there's no Guyanese ambassador in Venezuela, neither is there a Guyanese ambassador in Brazil. It's not easy to answer the question, but it's a fact that that's what is happening right now. So we will have to push the diplomatic, continue to push diplomacy, defense diplomacy up front. And yes, we can focus on some economic interests, and that's wide and large. Chevron, I think, now owns Hess. So Chevron is now in Guyana waters, whether they're there physically or not, because they bought the shares from Hess. We have offshore hydrocarbon facilities, hydrocarbons offshore. That is a national resource, which requires to be nationally protected. It is not protected by Guyana at the moment. We have not ring-fenced it with any defense assets, so that's a major concern to the people of Guyana. And also the maritime boundary that springs from the land boundary between Guyana and Venezuela. We have 240,000 square kilometers of exclusive economic zone, and that is also being threatened by Venezuela. So it's not only the land boundary is being threatened, it's also the maritime boundary. So those are other things to consider as we look at the geopolitical and the current risks and the way forward at this point in time.
Dr. Bess, I know I prevailed upon you for 30 minutes of your time, but I want to ask two more questions before we close out this evening.
Okay.
So the first one is kind of mildly sensitive. And this one has sort of come into in many discussions that I've had with many Guyanese here in the diaspora and Guyanese at home in various chat groups and social media, etc. This question of public opinion and the sentiment that it plays and the question of sort of this broadly couched sort of unity question. So there are two things that I want to ask here. You know, how does this sort of public opinion in Guyana kind of influence the path forward in this moment? And then two, if you believe that in a sense kind of a unified public influences the path forward, what more do we need to do in order to better unify the Guyanese public? I mean, it's been, it's an issue where, a number of folks have come to me and said, well, we'd like to be more involved, and there's not been an avenue for us to be involved. Folks that have said, well, we're not being, integrated into the kind of defense initiatives, the public opinion defense initiatives. What's your thought in that regard? So that's the first one, and then I want to hold you for one more.
Okay, that is quite interesting, and I think it's an interesting question for an interesting discussion. I think that in my view, if the government recognizes and accepts that the opposition is part of government and part of governance, it would make the unity or the unified approach to the development of Guyana much easier. I think the government is of the view that that is not the way to go, that they're government and they're about governance. But the Constitution prescribes that the opposition is part of government and part of governance. One has to read it, and it's very clear there. I think the issue of government and governance, that issue does not end with parliamentary participation by the opposition. It goes beyond that. And I believe that is why we don't seemingly have a unified approach, because it's the government that will have to reach out to the opposition in many instances. After the joint statement in Parliament, the government has been dealing with this matter by itself. So the opposition is left astride, and in many regards, issues its own statements in this particular instance. However, on this matter, we are still unified, even though there is an opposition and the opposition is left astride by the government. There is still unity. So for me, the government has to recognize that the opposition is part of government and governance, and to a large extent, civil society is part of governance, not necessarily government, but part of governance. And we have to mold and encourage civil society. At the end of the day, the elected officials in Parliament are from both the People's National Congress Reform, the Alliance for Change, other smaller parties, and the People's Progressive Party Civic. They're elected officials. So one has to recognize and give due cognizance to the role of elected officials and the fact that they were elected by the citizens of this country. So it is difficult in any political calculus for the government to even convince anyone, or any government to convince anyone, that we can lead the nation and manage the country without the involvement of the elected officials beyond Parliament, because that is not the case. I think that's where the challenge is. Besides the fact that we vote, how we vote in Guyana, we vote according to our political parties. Those are democratic issues. Democracy is a very messy thing, as we would say, from time to time. But I think the government has to do much more to have this unified approach. And I think it's within their maybe political philosophy to dominate all the institutions of governance, all the institutions that exist within the nation state. And that is very negative. It is very, I don't want to say undemocratic, but I would say it's very anti-Guyana to do that. We need to have more meaningful engagement of the opposition and civil society to have a unified approach. And also, Terence, it's important to remember and to keep in mind, Guyanese, the historical conditioning or the historical construct under which this nation, Guyana, developed. One has to remember that. And if you look at the historical constitution of the country, one recognize, based on that historical conduct, based on the fact that we have our indigenous population here at the time when the British and the Dutch came, met them, and disregarded their concept of life, disregarded that they had any concept of property, disregarded, that have any concept of civilization, brutalized them, and committed genocide. And then the enslaved Africans came here. Africans came here, were enslaved. They too laid the nation state, created it. And then the Indo-Guyanese came to Guyana and did their share. And when we look at that historical condition, we ought to be intricately working together for the benefit of this country. But we do not see that. We have to look back at our conditioning. And I would argue that we need a constitution that is birthed out of our history and not birthed out of what came through independence. We may need to go back, walk back that route and say, let's have a constitution that recognizes what the historical condition of the Guyanese, our Indo, Afro, African, and all our nations. And once that constitution recognizes that my story is known and told by the other, I recognize and accept your story, you recognize and accept my story, I think we begin to see each other and respect each other better. And despite who is in government, it is more likely that we involve the other side because there's no suspicion of the other side. So those are some of the things I think we can do to answer your questions. A long answer, but I thought I needed to mention all those constituent elements so that our listeners can have a broader perspective. I hope I haven't.
No. Can I hold? I think that's a beautiful answer. As you responded, it sort of in some small discussions. I've shared with colleagues that my roots are in the Pomeroon, and my ancestors were among those who were enslaved in the Pomeroon with the Dutch, and so it seems to me that I can't be but supportive of a Guyana Essequibo, and in as much as we have these sort of these challenges of today, this history is of vital importance, and it should inform how we think about our relationship to the Essequibo, and I think your answer really captures that. I know it's 7:37, so 3 minutes more I'm asking you for.
Yes.
So I wanted to give one last thought. So and I'll start on a personal note. So when I was a young man in high school, so I certainly had a very strong interest in the military. I remember wanting to join, as many of my friends and colleagues at high school did, to join the Officer Cadet Corps. And I didn't join because in the year that I was supposed to sign up for the officer cadet training, a young man had died. I think the place was Takama. That was the training place. A young man had died at Takama, and my mother said, "Boy, I don't want you to go anywhere near the army." And so I harbor a certain love for the Guyana Defense Force. I mean, some of the younger students at school who I can think of immediately, like Colonel Julius Skeet, who was like one class below. I really appreciated the service that they engaged in, and I've always felt that there is this really critical role for the military in a developing Guyana. And so this brings me to the last question that I wanted to ask, which is, a military is often about defense, and so I wanted to ask about what deterrent defense. I mean, so coming back to where we started at the beginning with the unfortunate crash of the helicopter, and a number of my colleagues have written to me saying, I don't know why you believe in these people so much, you believe in this Guyana so much, why would your people send all of these senior ranks on one helicopter? And I have to say, well, I don't know what the mission is and what the protocol, the operational protocol is, and so on. But there is a sense for many of us, that there is to kind of assess what deterrent effect does the military as an institution have in this context.
You mean the Guyana Defense Force?
Guyana Defense Force.
Well,
Guyana at this moment.
it goes back to
defend Guyana for against an adversary like Venezuela?
Well, it goes back to that calculus I talked about earlier. The Guyana Defense Force, in the context of Venezuela, uh, operates in a particular manner because of size, because of scale, and it is led by defense diplomacy. And I made the point earlier, because of a rigorous defense diplomacy, at least in the 1970s and 1980s, that gave Venezuela cause to pause. In this instance, it did not happen. So, with that particular total national defense construct led by defense diplomacy that was constructed by the then People's National Congress, our diplomats will be out on the front line all across the world, special envoys speaking to every organization to give that cause a pause. The Defense Force now is exceptionally motivated by that and trained to fight for a limited period of time. During that period of time when it is in active combat, if it comes to that, that defense diplomacy kicks in and that causes a pause, will allow the issue or the matter to be addressed internationally. So I would say that the Guyana Defense Force is equipped to execute that particular mission, that mission where there is an active defense diplomacy, there is on the horizon many international actors and organizations that will give Venezuela cause to pause. And if at any point in time they were to get across the border, then exactly they know how to engage and for what period of time they will engage. Because the level of engagement will determine, of course, your battle preparedness, the amount of equipment you have, and so forth. So that's how that it was constructed. So and I think the reason, I'm glad you asked the question, because persons look at it, okay, the size of Guyana and the size of Venezuela, but we had to construct a defense policy that was different, the one that took into consideration a small defense force and one that takes into consideration a larger enemy. But there are other types of defense assets that exist that we can look at. The government of Guyana, for example, total radar coverage of our airspace, that's a defense asset. A communication satellite for CARICOM, that is a defense asset. It's something Guyana can sponsor, Guyana can finance. An entire CARICOM could benefit from the communication satellite. So we will know exactly where our assets are, whether it's military or civilian. A lot of persons within CARICOM use the waterways, use the Caribbean Sea. So we can know that there are other types of defense assets that can be employed that make a nation safe. For example, for frontier communities, some of the first villages that were titled were the Amerindian village on the frontier. So we're talking about living borders. If we have those living borders of frontier communities developed, they're a first line of defense. A larger reserve that we have, a small defense force with a large reserve. Those are things that we had as part of a construct in the past. We need to return to them. And the important thing also to mention here is, and I didn't mention it before, I need to mention it before we close, is that the territory of Guyana, that landmass that we inherited from the British at independence, is deeply entrenched in our constitution. Only a national referendum can change the borders of Guyana. And that means you have a national election with one thing on the ballot, which is, do we change the border? Do we give up land to anyone else? That is in the Constitution. And I think the president, and they're quite aware of that. And if at least it came to prominence more recently, I have reminded the nation and reminded the government of that particular Article 2.1. It was placed in the Constitution since 1966. It wasn't placed in the 1980 Constitution, the famous Bonham Constitution. It was placed since 1966. It was deeply entrenched. So even though there are a lot of conversation about land and opening to the Atlantic, and different political actors may have said that, at no point in time can it be executed without a national referendum, meaning without the voice of the people agreeing to it. So that is also important. So that in itself is a major defense asset that we have. That is a major defense asset given to us by the founders of our Constitution, even though we know quite a lot of it came from the British. And I doubt the British put that in there. That had to be Guyanese politicians who put that in there. Ensure that we don't change these borders at any point in time unless there's a national referendum. It's a people's matter. So that is my
Yeah.
That is my answer to your last question.
Yeah, I could keep you here all night, but I'll give you one last word to say a closing remark. But you just hit on something that is really, from a logical standpoint, quite interesting. So you've just said that our Constitution explicitly says that any question about changing the border has to go to a national referendum.
Well, let me just clarify. It doesn't say a national referendum. What the Constitution says that our land boundaries, paraphrasing, right? You can't change it, paraphrase
Change
it. But it is that particular article in the Constitution. If you want to change it, you have to go by national
the
referendum.
only way that it
It doesn't
happens.
expressly say that, and that is very clear. It also says that Guyana is indivisible. It says Guyana is indivisible. That's in our Constitution. It is indivisible. It can't be divided. But we can add to the territory, but we cannot subtract from the territory of Guyana based on how the Constitution is written. So again, that is a defense asset. And if that is made public more often, people recognize that I have to be part of giving away my country. I have to be part of giving away this land. So that is a critical defense asset that was placed in the Constitution since 1966. And credit must be given to the framers of the Constitution then, and for the subsequent retention of that clause, that article in the Constitution, right through to today.
I know I prevailed upon you beyond the time that you agreed upon.
Yes.
It's 7:46 my time, so it's 8:46 your time. So I'll give you one more minute to say. I'll say thank you first, and give you 1 minute to say anything else that you wanted to say in this regard. I think I've gotten most of the questions. I have a few more, but I'll leave them for a subsequent conversation.
Right. Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Blackman, on your program, and thanks to the viewers for listening. We are at a very important and critical time in this country, in Guyana. I believe we need a unified approach to this particular issue in Venezuela. And also, I think it's important to have a CARICOM, our CARICOM brothers and sisters in our corner. I think we cannot do it alone nationally, neither can we do it alone regionally. So I will urge all the political actors out there to ensure that the opposition and other civil society are involved intricately in dealing with this issue of Venezuela. President Maduro has claimed he has the people behind him. That's what he's claiming from this referendum. Our government in this country, the government in this country, and must be able to distinguishingly say it has the people behind it. And it can only do that if the rest of the nation is involved in this particular issue as we deal with Guyana Venezuela. Not to mention, or not to separate or subtract from going forward, we need to have a unified approach to national development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Best, and have a wonderful evening. It's been a real pleasure having you. And
My pleasure too.
like you said, I'm always very impressed by your intellectual acumen among with these things. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.